August 17, 1853, St. James Parish, Louisiana. A plantation overseer vanishes into the bayou during his nightly rounds, leaving nothing but a single boot at the water's edge and the distant sound of thrashing in the darkness. Within 6 months, 14 more white men would disappear from the surrounding estates, all last seen near the swamps, all presumed victims of accidents or runaways. But what if I told you these weren't accidents at all? What if every single death was carefully orchestrated by one woman who turned the bayou itself into an execution chamber? This isn't a story about random violence or spontaneous revenge. This is about calculated, methodical justice delivered by a woman who understood that in the Louisiana lowlands, the swamp keeps secrets better than any grave. She didn't just kill her oppressors, she erased them. Before we continue, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive, uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member and don't forget to hit the like button. Now let me introduce you to the men who thought themselves untouchable. Jean-Baptiste Roussel owned the largest plantation in St. James Parish, a sprawling estate called Belle Ombre that stretched along the Mississippi River for miles. To the outside world, to visitors from New Orleans, to his fellow plantation aristocracy, Roussel was a gentleman of the highest order, educated in France, fluent in 3 languages, a regular contributor to the local Episcopal Church. His neighbors included the Thibodeau brothers, Marcel and Etienne, whose adjoining properties formed an empire of sugar production. Then there were the overseers, brutal men like Samuel Hewitt and Thomas Garrett, poor whites who'd clawed their way up to positions of minor authority and wielded it with sadistic enthusiasm. These weren't the cartoonish villains of popular imagination. They wore fine clothes, attended social gatherings, wrote letters about philosophy and agriculture. Roussel himself kept a journal where he mused about honor and duty. But let's be real, these same men who discussed Aristotle over brandy were the ones who'd have a woman whipped for looking them in the eye, who'd sell children away from their mothers to settle gambling debts, who'd force themselves on enslaved women and call it their divine right. Respectability, you see, has always been slavery's most effective mask. Here's what made St. James Parish particularly dangerous for enslaved people and particularly perfect for what was about to happen. The official story everyone believed was that the bayou was deadly. Not metaphorically, literally. Drownings were common, or so the records claimed. Every few months, someone would disappear into the swamps, and the white authorities would nod knowingly and mark it down as another unfortunate accident. Runaways fleeing north would get disoriented in the maze of waterways and simply vanish. Drunk overseers would stumble off paths during night patrols and meet their end in the jaws of an alligator or the depths of a sinkhole. Even some enslaved people who tried to escape met this fate, their bodies occasionally washing up days later, barely recognizable. The white population had constructed an entire mythology around the bayou's dangers. It was nature's prison guard, they'd say, keeping the enslaved population in check better than any patrol. Local newspapers would run sensationalized stories about massive alligators, about quicksand that could swallow a horse and rider, about deadly water moccasins, thick as a man's arm. This narrative served a dual purpose. It terrified the enslaved into staying put, and it provided a perfect explanation for any disappearance that might raise awkward questions. When men vanished, everyone just assumed the bayou had claimed another victim. But what the white population couldn't understand really, because they'd never bothered to learn, was that the enslaved community had their own complete knowledge system of the bayou. For generations, people who'd been brought from West Africa, from the Caribbean, from other parts of the South, had been mapping these waterways in their minds. They knew which channels ran deep, which were choked with vegetation, where the alligators nested, when they fed, how they hunted. They knew the sound a gator makes before it strikes, the way the water ripples when one is approaching, the exact spots where the currents would carry a body away from shore and into the deeper swamps where it would never be found. This knowledge was survival, passed down through whispered conversations in the slave quarters, through songs that sounded like spirituals but contained detailed geographical information, through the work of fishermen and trappers who supplemented their masters' tables with catches from the bayou. There was even an informal network, certain trusted individuals who could navigate the swamps at night, who could read the stars and the moss growth and the water flow like a book. If you needed to move through the bayou unseen, if you needed something to disappear forever, there were people who knew how. And at the center of this network, unknown to almost everyone, was a woman named Cecile. When the disappearances started in earnest, August 1853 through February 1854, the white authorities had ready explanations for everything. Samuel Hewitt, the first to vanish? He was known to drink heavily, everyone said. He'd probably stumbled into the bayou drunk and drowned. No mystery there. When Thomas Garrett disappeared 3 weeks later, the story was that he'd been chasing a runaway and got lost in the swamps after dark. His horse returned without him, which everyone took as proof he'd met with some accident. Then came René Broussard, a visiting overseer from a neighboring parish. His disappearance was blamed on his unfamiliarity with the local waterways. He'd gone fishing alone and clearly gotten in over his head, literally. Each disappearance had its own neat explanation, and because these men disappeared from different plantations, over different time periods, with different circumstances, no pattern was immediately obvious. The local sheriff, a man named Augustus Pritchard, did conduct cursory investigations, but they consisted mainly of searching the immediate areas where the men were last seen, asking a few questions, then concluding that the bayou had claimed another victim. This is where the story gets truly chilling. Pritchard was actually relieved by these explanations. Dead overseers meant he didn't have to deal with potential conflicts or complaints. The system kept running smoothly, profits kept flowing, and if the swamp occasionally claimed a few white men, well, that was just the price of doing business in Louisiana. Now you have to understand something crucial. Cecile didn't work alone. She couldn't have. What she accomplished required a network of silent witnesses, people who saw things and said nothing, who created alibis, who ensured she was always somewhere visible when the disappearances occurred. The key collaborator was a man named Baptiste, no relation to Jean-Baptiste Roussel, though the shared name is a bitter irony. Baptiste was the head fisherman at Belle Ombre, responsible for providing fresh fish and game to the plantation house. His legitimate work gave him a reason to be in the bayou at all hours, to know the waterways intimately, to come and go without suspicion. He had a small bateau, a flat-bottomed boat perfect for navigating shallow waters. Then there was Marguerite, the head house servant at the Thibodeau plantation, who could track the movements of every white person on the property and pass along information about schedules, habits, vulnerabilities. There was Prosper, a stable hand, who could ensure horses were unavailable or accidentally left unsaddled at crucial moments. And there were others, at least a dozen people who formed a silent conspiracy, bound together by shared suffering and a collective understanding that what was happening was a form of justice, however terrible. They never spoke of it directly, they never acknowledged it aloud, but they all knew, and they all chose to turn their faces away when the bayou called another master to account. Let's be clear about something. When I say victims, I'm talking about the 15 white men who disappeared. But to understand why they were targeted, you need to understand what they did, who the real victims were. Samuel Hewitt had beaten an enslaved woman named Rose so severely she lost her unborn child and nearly died herself. Thomas Garrett had separated 5 families in a single month, selling children as young as 6 to distant plantations for profit. Jean-Baptiste Roussel himself had fathered at least 7 children with enslaved women, children he refused to acknowledge, children who were born into slavery under his own roof. René Broussard had been hired specifically because of his reputation for breaking difficult slaves through torture. These weren't random targets. Each man had committed specific atrocities, had caused specific suffering that Cecile had witnessed or knew about in detail. She kept a mental ledger, a precise accounting of crimes and punishments owed. Some of the men were overseers, positions of middling power but maximum cruelty. Others were owners, wealthy and respected, their crimes hidden behind closed doors. What they shared was a sense of absolute impunity. They genuinely believed there would never be consequences for their actions. They believed the system protected them completely. They believed enslaved people were incapable of organized resistance. They believed the Bayou was their moat, keeping them safe. Every single one of those beliefs was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. His name was Etienne Dufour, and his great misfortune was being in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Dufour was a 19-year-old white boy, son of a small farmer, who'd hired him out to Belle Ombre to earn extra money. He wasn't an overseer, wasn't particularly cruel, just a kid trying to make a living in a brutal system. On the night of October 12, 1853, Dufour was returning from a neighboring plantation where he'd been visiting a girl. He took a shortcut along the Bayou path, one he'd used dozens of times before. What he saw made him freeze behind a stand of cypress trees. Samuel Hewitt, the overseer everyone thought had drowned weeks earlier, very much alive and walking along the water's edge in the moonlight. But before Dufour could call out or process what he was seeing, he witnessed a figure emerge from the shadows, a black woman he recognized as one of the house servants from Belle Ombre. She was carrying something, leading something, and then he heard Hewitt cry out, saw the man stumble, heard a massive splash and thrashing in the water that lasted less than a minute before silence fell again. The woman stood at the water's edge for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward the quarters. Dufour stood paralyzed for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When he finally moved, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely walk. He had just witnessed a murder, and he had no idea what to do about it. Etienne Dufour didn't sleep for 3 days. He couldn't eat. When he finally worked up the courage to tell someone what he'd seen, he went to his father, who listened with an increasingly skeptical expression. "You're saying you saw Samuel Hewitt, who drowned a month ago, walking by the bayou, and then a slave woman somehow made him fall in?" His father shook his head. "Boy, you've been working too hard. The heat's gotten to you." But Dufour insisted, so his father finally took him to Sheriff Pritchard. The sheriff listened, made notes, asked where exactly this had happened. Then he delivered his verdict. "Son, Samuel Hewitt was found dead, what was left of him anyway, 3 weeks ago. Gator got him, clear as day. Now, I don't know if you've been drinking, or if you had a bad dream, but what you're describing is impossible." Dufour tried to explain the timing, the details, but the sheriff cut him off. "You want me to believe a Negro woman overpowered a full-grown man and fed him to gators? And that somehow this happened after he was already dead? Listen to yourself." The dismissal was complete. Devastating. Dufour left that office knowing the truth, and knowing no one would ever believe him. The system protected its own narrative more fiercely than it protected its people. And somewhere on Belle Ombre Plantation, Cécile continued her work, now knowing she had been seen, and that it didn't matter. The truth was too impossible for white people to accept. Sheriff Pritchard did exactly what you'd expect. He conducted an investigation designed to find nothing. He rode out to Belle Ombre, interviewed Jean-Baptiste Roussel, asked if any of his slaves had been acting strangely. Roussel assured him that his people were well behaved and accounted for every night. "My servants sleep in the quarters under lock and key," he explained. "It's impossible for any of them to roam at night without being noticed." This was a lie, of course. The quarters weren't actually locked, and people moved about regularly, but Pritchard accepted it without question. He then made a show of questioning several enslaved people, with their masters present, asking if they'd seen anything unusual by the bayou. The answers were predictable. Downcast eyes, quiet, no sirs, a performance of ignorance and submission. Pritchard wrote in his report, "Investigated claims of suspicious activity, found no evidence of foul play. Local Negro population appears docile and accounted for. Conclude that disappearances result from natural hazards of bayou environment. No further action warranted." The investigation lasted exactly 4 hours. What's fascinating is that Pritchard almost certainly knew he was being played. But accepting that truth would mean acknowledging that enslaved people were capable of organized, sophisticated resistance. It would mean admitting that the entire system of control was an illusion. It would mean recognizing enslaved people as thinking, planning, dangerous human beings, That was unthinkable, so he chose the comfortable lie and filed it away. But there were other witnesses, living ones, who carried the evidence in their own bodies and minds. The enslaved people on these plantations knew exactly what was happening, and while most stayed silent, some showed signs of psychological transformation. Rose, the woman Samuel Hewitt had beaten nearly to death, stopped flinching when white men walked past her. Her posture changed, straighter, more deliberate. Other women who'd been repeatedly assaulted began holding eye contact just a fraction of a second longer, a tiny act of defiance that would have been unthinkable before. Children who'd been separated from parents and then, mysteriously, some of those traders and overseers involved in those sales disappeared. These children showed a different kind of awareness. They watched everything. They listened to everything. They learned to read the subtle signs of when justice was being served in the only way available to them. The white population noticed these changes but misinterpreted them. "The Negroes have been peculiarly quiet lately," Roussel wrote in his journal in December 1853. "Almost serene. Perhaps the recent losses have reminded them of the dangers beyond the plantation boundaries." He thought fear was keeping them subdued. He couldn't have been more wrong. What he was witnessing was hope, the dangerous, revolutionary realization that the powerful could be held accountable, that vengeance was possible, that the system had cracks. The most altered victim was Cecile herself, though no white person looked at her closely enough to notice the change in her eyes. Now let's talk about how she actually did it, because this is where the story becomes almost unbearably precise and calculated. Cecile had studied alligator behavior for years, not academically, but through careful observation during her work. She knew that alligators are ambush predators who hunt primarily at night, that they're attracted to splashing and distressed movement in the water, that they prefer prey at the water's edge, where they can strike quickly and drag their victim under. She knew the exact spots along the bayou where the largest gators congregated, where the water dropped off sharply into deep channels. She knew that gators typically drown their prey by rolling, the infamous death roll, before tearing them apart or stashing them underwater to decompose for easier eating. Her method was elegant in its simplicity. She would lure each target to a specific location near the water, usually with a story about a runaway hiding nearby or valuable property that needed checking. Baptiste would be positioned in the shadows with a wooden club or heavy tool. The target would approach the water's edge, and one sharp blow to the back of the head would drop him. Not dead, unconscious. Then he'd be rolled into the water at precisely the right spot, making enough noise to attract attention. Within seconds, sometimes less than a minute, the gators would respond. The victims would regain consciousness just in time to experience their own drowning and dismemberment. No evidence remained. Gators consume bone and all. This is where the story turns, because every act of resistance, no matter how justified, eventually faces a reckoning. And the person who would bring that reckoning wasn't who you'd expect. Her name was Félicité Laveau, no relation to the famous Marie Laveau of New Orleans, though the shared surname isn't coincidental. Both families came from the same free Creole community. Félicité was what they called a femme de couleur libre, a free woman of color who owned a small general store in the town of Convent, about 5 miles from the Plantation district. She was in her mid-40s, educated, literate, and deeply religious. She was also haunted by guilt. Her freedom had come because her grandmother had been manumitted by a white father who'd actually acknowledged his mixed-race children, a rare thing. She'd been raised with relative privilege while other black people suffered in bondage. That guilt drove her to become what we'd now call an abolitionist, though she couldn't use that word openly in Louisiana. She helped runaways when she could, passed information, provided supplies. But Félicité had a problem. She believed in law, in justice through proper channels, in moral righteousness that could be publicly defended. When rumors of the disappearances reached her, whispers from enslaved people who came to her store, she initially felt satisfaction. But as the body count grew, she became troubled. This wasn't justice, she thought. This was vengeance, and vengeance would bring retribution down on everyone. She decided to investigate, to discover the truth. And then, God help her, to stop it. Félicité began carefully, knowing that asking direct questions would get her nowhere. Instead, she offered her store as a gathering place, gave small gifts to enslaved people who came in, a bit of ribbon, some peppermint, small kindnesses that built trust. She listened more than she spoke. She noted patterns, which plantations had lost overseers, which enslaved people seemed less afraid, who visited her store in the days before and after each disappearance. She began making maps, tracking dates and locations. The pattern that emerged was undeniable. Every disappearance connected to Bel Ombre in some way, and at the center of it all was one name that kept appearing in whispered conversations: Cécile. Félicité knew her slightly, had sold her fabric once, had exchanged a few words. A quiet woman, maybe 30 years old, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person you'd never notice in a crowd. But when Félicité really thought about it, she realized Cécile had access to the main house, knew everyone's schedules, and had family connections to several other plantations through marriages and kinship. In early February 1854, Félicité made a dangerous decision. She would confront Cécile directly. She sent word through a trusted intermediary that she needed to speak with her privately. The meeting was arranged for a Sunday evening at the edge of the bayou, near a small chapel where both free and enslaved black people sometimes gathered for worship. Félicité went alone, carrying nothing but her Bible and her conviction. What she didn't know was that this meeting would change everything. Now, before I tell you what happened at that meeting, I need you to pause and really consider what we're dealing with here. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where the moral lines you thought were clear become blurred beyond recognition. We're about to confront questions that have no easy answers. When does justice become murder? When does survival become vengeance? At what point does the oppressed become the oppressor? If you're still with me, if you're ready to go deeper into this darkness, I need you to do something. Drop a comment below telling me, could you have stayed silent if you'd known what Cécile was doing? Would you have helped her, stopped her, or looked away? This is Echoes of Truth, where we don't just tell stories, we force ourselves to confront the uncomfortable realities they reveal. Hit that subscribe button, because the next episode will explore another case where the line between hero and villain disappears entirely. Turn on notifications. Share this with someone who can handle difficult truths. And remember, we're not here for comfortable history. We're here for the truth, no matter how disturbing. Now, let's return to that Bayou meeting between Félicité and Cécile, because what happened there would determine whether the killing stopped or escalated beyond anyone's control. They met at dusk, when the bayou begins to blur the line between earth and water, between solid ground and deadly depths. Félicité started with careful questions, probing gently, but Cécile cut through the pretense immediately. You know what I've done, she said quietly. The question is, what you plan to do about it. Félicité, caught off guard by the directness, asked why, and Cécile told her, every name, every crime, every justification. She spoke for nearly an hour, recounting specific atrocities, not abstractions, but detailed horrors. She described holding Rose's hand while the woman bled from Hewitt's beating. She described watching Roussel's children, born of rape, working in the fields alongside their half-siblings who'd inherited privilege through legitimate birth. She described a boy named Caleb who'd been sold away from his mother and walked back 30 miles only to be caught and whipped to death as an example. Thomas Garrett had done that killing personally. You want me to stop? Cécile asked. 3 more names on my list. 3 more men who deserve exactly what they're going to get. After that, I'm done. Then she revealed something that made Félicité's blood freeze. She had kept evidence. Pressed in a book hidden in the quarters were newspaper clippings about each disappearance, small tokens from each victim, a button, a watch chain, and detailed written records of their crimes. If anything happens to me, someone else will find these, and they'll finish what I started. What Félicité didn't know was that they were being watched. Etienne Dufour, the young man who'd witnessed Hewitt's death and been dismissed by the sheriff, had developed an obsession with the bayou. He patrolled it nightly, convinced that if he could catch the killer in the act, he'd finally be believed. When he saw two women meeting in the gathering darkness, he crept closer to listen, and he heard everything. The confessions, the plans, the evidence. When Cécile finally walked away, disappearing into the darkness toward the quarters, Dufour made his move. He grabbed Félicité roughly, demanded to know where the evidence was hidden, told her she was going straight to the sheriff and would tell everything she'd heard. But Félicité was stronger than he expected, and she'd grown up fighting for every advantage in a world hostile to free black women. She twisted out of his grip, shoved him hard, and ran. Dufour gave chase, crashing through the underbrush along the bayou's edge. The sound was tremendous. Branches breaking, water splashing, both of them shouting. And then Félicité made a fatal mistake. She left the path, trying to cut through a narrow section of swamp she thought she knew. Her foot plunged through what looked like solid ground into sucking mud. She went down hard. Dufour was on her in seconds, grabbing her arm, pulling her toward the path. And that's when they both heard it. The sound of something massive sliding into the water nearby. They froze, and in that moment of shared terror, everything changed. Dufour hauled Félicité up, and together they scrambled back to solid ground, running until they reached the small chapel, both gasping. In the sanctuary of that space, with a full moon rising and their hearts pounding, they had to make a choice. Dufour spoke first. "You know where the evidence is. You heard her confess. We go to the authorities now, or we're as guilty as she is." But Félicité, still catching her breath, said something that would haunt Dufour for the rest of his life. "You want to condemn her for killing monsters? Every man she killed earned his death 10 times over. What law protects her? What justice addresses what was done to her and hers?" Dufour argued. Of course he did. Murder was murder. The law was the law. But even as he spoke, he realized how hollow it sounded. What law had prosecuted Hewitt for beating Rose nearly to death? What justice had Samuel Garrett faced for selling children? None. Silence was the law's only response to atrocities against enslaved people. Yet Dufour couldn't accept vigilante killing either. They reached a compromise. They would wait. Watch. If Cécile killed again, they'd report everything. If she kept her word about stopping after 3 more, they'd say nothing. It was a devil's bargain, and both knew it. They parted ways that night, carrying knowledge neither wanted. But some secrets are too large to contain. 3 weeks later, on February 28, 1854, the 15th disappearance occurred. A plantation owner named Virgil Comeau vanished while checking his sugar mill equipment at night. Unlike the others, his wife didn't accept the Bayou accident explanation. She was a formidable woman named Theodora, and she demanded a real investigation. She threatened to contact authorities in New Orleans to make a public scandal. Reluctantly, Sheriff Pritchard assembled a proper search party. 20 men with dogs, torches, and weapons combed the bayou areas around Belle Ombre and surrounding plantations. What they found shocked everyone. In a small cabin used for storing fishing equipment, Baptiste's cabin, they discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside was Cécile's book of evidence, newspaper clippings, the small trophies from each victim, and most damning of all, pages of carefully written French documenting each man's crimes and the date of his execution. The handwriting was educated, precise, literate, which shocked the searchers almost as much as the content. The idea that an enslaved woman could write, could document, could plan with such sophistication challenged everything they believed about black people's capabilities. They also found implements, a wooden club, lengths of rope, dried herbs that some claimed were voodoo charms, but were probably just medicinal plants. The evidence was undeniable. A calculated, systematic execution campaign had been operating under their noses for 6 months. The arrests came swiftly. Cécile was seized from the Belle Ombre quarters and thrown into the St. James Parish jail. Baptiste was arrested next, then Marguerite, then Prosper. In total, 8 people were detained. The trials were scheduled immediately. There would be no delay, no chance for the story to spread and inspire others. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals the true villainy. During the investigation that followed, authorities discovered evidence that Jean-Baptiste Roussel himself had known something was wrong. His journal, examined as part of the investigation, contained entries from November 1853 that mentioned unusual behaviors among his enslaved people and subtle insolence that concerned him. He'd noticed the changes, but had chosen to do nothing, to watch and wait. Why? Because he was curious. He wanted to see if his suspicions about organized resistance were true. He'd essentially allowed several of his fellow planters to die just to satisfy his intellectual curiosity and gather intelligence. When this emerged, it scandalized the white community. The Thibodeau brothers, Marcel and Etienne, one had already been killed by Cécile, the other now revealed as having been part of an informal alliance with Roussel to study Negro behavioral patterns by allowing certain freedoms and watching what happened. They'd been running a twisted experiment using their fellow white men as unknowing subjects. The villains, it turned out, were everywhere, both the obvious ones Cécile had killed and the subtle ones who'd enabled everything. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something even more disturbing. This wasn't an isolated incident. Through interrogations and seized correspondence, they discovered that information about resistance tactics, including the Bayou method, had been shared across a network of enslaved people stretching from Louisiana through Mississippi and into Alabama. The network used coded language embedded in spirituals, hidden messages in traded goods, and trusted intermediaries, often free people of color like Félicité, to pass information between plantations. The authorities found evidence of at least 3 other cases in Louisiana where suspicious disappearances of white overseers had occurred near swamps or waterways, all following similar patterns. One case in Ascension Parish involved 2 overseers found dead in a cypress swamp, officially ruled accidental drownings. Another in Terrebonne Parish had a plantation owner disappear while duck hunting. His body was never recovered, just like so many of Cécile's victims. The network even had international connections. Testimony revealed that tactics were being shared with people in Caribbean colonies where slavery still existed, and information was flowing back and forth about which methods of resistance were most effective. This wasn't random violence. It was a coordinated, sophisticated resistance movement using geography and white assumptions about black capabilities as weapons. The scope terrified the white population more than any open rebellion could have. Open rebellion could be met with military force. This invisible, intelligent resistance could be anywhere, happening right under their noses. Here's what makes this story particularly haunting. The wider white society engaged in a massive conspiracy of silence about what had really happened. Local newspapers reported the arrests, but downplayed the sophistication of the operation. The stories emphasized voodoo superstition and primitive savagery, rather than acknowledging the intelligence and planning involved. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate policy. If the white population fully understood what had happened, if they grasped that enslaved people were capable of such organization and restraint, the entire ideological foundation of slavery would crack. Slavery depended on the myth of black inferiority, of childlike dependence, of incapacity for complex thought. Cécile's campaign proved all of that false, so the newspapers lied. They minimized. They reconstructed the narrative to fit comfortable assumptions. Reports sent to authorities in New Orleans were similarly sanitized. The Catholic Church, which held enormous influence in Louisiana, preached sermons about forgiveness and the dangers of racial insurrection, but never addressed the atrocities that had provoked the resistance. Elite planters held private meetings where they discussed security improvements, but publicly maintained that nothing significant had happened. Even Theodora Comeau, whose husband's death had triggered the investigation, was pressured to stop asking questions and accept a financial settlement. The conspiracy of silence extended across all levels of society, all united in the desperate need to pretend that enslaved people were incapable of what everyone now knew they were absolutely capable of. The trials were swift and brutal. Cécile was convicted of 15 counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Baptiste received the same sentence. Marguerite and Prosper were convicted as accessories and sentenced to be sold out of state, a death sentence of another kind, erasing them from their communities and families forever. 4 others were whipped publicly and sold. Cecile's execution was scheduled for April 15, 1854, and was conducted publicly in the parish square. Accounts say she walked to the gallows with her head high, refusing the priest who offered last rites, speaking no final words. Baptiste was hanged beside her. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves outside consecrated ground. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Jean-Baptiste Roussel faced no legal consequences for his role in enabling the deaths. He quietly sold Belle Ombre and moved to France, living comfortably on his sugar fortune until his death in 1869. The surviving Thibodeau brother similarly escaped accountability. Etienne Dufour, racked with guilt over his role in the events, left Louisiana and was last recorded living in Texas under an assumed name. And Félicité Laveau, she closed her store and disappeared from all records. Some say she went north. Others claim she continued the network's work in secret. Her fate remains unknown. The system protected its own, punished resistance, and continued exactly as before. So what do we take from this? What's the moral of a story where the righteous became murderers and the murderers were people defending themselves from horrors we can barely imagine? The legacy of Cecile's campaign rippled in ways both obvious and subtle. In the immediate aftermath, security on Louisiana plantations tightened dramatically. Enslaved people faced harsher restrictions, more frequent patrols, increased surveillance. The resistance network was damaged but never fully destroyed. It went deeper underground, became more careful, more patient. Some historians argue that the psychological impact on both enslaved and white populations was profound. Enslaved people learned that resistance was possible, that the powerful could be vulnerable. White slaveholders learned to fear not just open rebellion, but the quiet, patient vengeance of people they'd underestimated. But here's the deeper truth. This story reveals the impossible moral position slavery created. When legal justice doesn't exist, when atrocities have no official remedy, when human beings are legally property with no recourse against violence, what options remain? We want to believe in pure heroes and clear villains, in resistance that's morally uncomplicated. But real history is messier. Cecile was simultaneously a victim seeking justice and a serial killer. Her actions were simultaneously understandable and horrifying. The men she killed were monsters and human beings. There's no clean resolution here, no comfortable lesson. Just the devastating reality that slavery poisoned everyone it touched, creating situations where the only justice available was the kind that left everyone morally compromised. Let's be real with each other for a moment. Could something like this happen today? Could systematic oppression push people to systematic vengeance? Would we recognize it if it was happening? Or would we, like the white authorities of 1853, construct comfortable narratives that let us ignore the truth? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are challenges for anyone who thinks history is safely in the past. Drop a comment below. Do you think Cecile was a hero, a villain, or something more complicated than either label allows? What would you have done in Félicité's position? Would you have stopped the killing or looked away? This is Echoes of Truth, where we explore the stories that make us uncomfortable because comfort is the enemy of understanding. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because next episode we're investigating the Chicago Stockyards murders of 1897. Another case where the line between justice and vengeance dissolved in blood, where immigrant workers took revenge on the industrial system that was literally grinding them to death. Share this video with someone who can handle difficult conversations. Comment your location. I want to know where my fellow truth seekers are watching from. And remember, the Bayou keeps its secrets, but we don't have to. The dead deserve to be remembered, all of them, even when their stories challenge everything we thought we knew about right and wrong. Until next time, keep questioning, keep digging, keep seeking the echoes of truth.